Deep beneath the deserts of Egypt, buried in the myths of Sumer, and hidden in the abduction reports of modern-day witnesses, there is a claim so strange that most people dismiss it before they even hear the evidence. That claim is simple. We are not alone, and we may never have been alone. According to a growing number of researchers, authors, and self-described ancient astronaut theorists, the human race may not be a purely terrestrial creation. They argue that our history, and possibly our biology, carries the fingerprints of something else, something that arrived long before recorded history, and something that, according to these theorists, may still be here. This is the theory of the human hybrid. Stay with this, because the story does not start with flying saucers or men in black. It starts with clay tablets older than the pyramids, with texts written in a language most people have never heard of, and with a question that has haunted archaeologists for over a century. Why do so many ancient cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, all describe the same thing? Gods who came from the sky, gods who mixed their blood with humans, beings who were not quite human and not quite divine. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is where this theory gets its strongest foothold. In ancient Sumer, in what is now modern-day Iraq, scribes carved into clay tablets a story of beings called the Anunnaki. Translated loosely, the word means those who from heaven to earth came. According to these texts, the Anunnaki were not myths or metaphors to the Sumerians. They were recorded as literal beings, described as having descended from the sky to rule over early humanity. Ancient astronaut theorists argue that the level of detail in these texts, genealogies, hierarchies, specific tasks assigned to specific beings, reads less like religious allegory and more like a historical record. Author Erich von Däniken, whose 1968 book Chariots of the Gods is often credited with launching the entire ancient astronaut movement, argued that early humans lacked the vocabulary to describe advanced technology, so they used the only language available to them, the language of gods and miracles. A chariot that flies becomes a fiery chariot in the sky. A being with tools beyond human comprehension becomes a god with powers beyond mortal men. If you accept that premise, the Anunnaki texts stop looking like fantasy and start looking, to these researchers, like a garbled transmission of an actual historical event. But the Anunnaki story doesn't stop at simple contact. According to the Sumerian tablets, and according to the interpretation pushed by ancient astronaut theorists, these beings didn't just visit. They intervened directly in human biology. The texts describe the creation of early man not as a spontaneous act of a distant creator, but as a deliberate genetic project. A being called Enki, along with other Anunnaki, are described as combining their own genetic material with that of early hominids to create a hybrid worker species. A being built to labor, built to serve, and built, crucially, with a mixture of two bloodlines. If that sounds unbelievable, consider that it is far from the only ancient text making this claim. Move from Sumer to the pages of the Bible, specifically the book of Genesis, chapter 6. Most people who have read the Bible remember Noah and the flood. Fewer remember what comes right before it, a passage describing a group called the Nephilim. The text reads that the sons of God saw the daughters of man, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves. From this union, the text says, came giants, beings described as mighty men, men of renown. Theologians have debated the meaning of sons of God for centuries. Some argue it refers to a righteous human bloodline. But ancient astronaut theorists point to a much older, much stranger interpretation, one supported by the Book of Enoch, a text that didn't make it into the standard biblical canon, but was widely read by ancient Jewish and early Christian communities. The Book of Enoch describes the sons of God not as men, but as a class of beings called the Watchers, angelic figures who descended to earth, took human wives, and produced offspring described as violent, immense in size, and destructive to the natural world. According to this account, the resulting hybrid beings were so disruptive to the balance of life on Earth that their existence is cited as one of the direct causes of the Great Flood. Ancient astronaut theorists ask a simple question here. Why would two completely separate ancient cultures, the Sumerians with their Anunnaki and the Hebrews with their Nephilim, describe the same basic event, sky beings interbreeding with humans, producing a distinct and often oversized hybrid offspring? Coincidence, these researchers argue, becomes much harder to accept the more times the same pattern repeats. And it does repeat. Across the ocean to Central America, and the Popol Vuh, the sacred creation text of the Maya, describes gods who attempted to create humanity multiple times, discarding earlier failed versions of man before arriving at a final version deemed suitable. Head to ancient Egypt, and you find a pantheon of gods frequently depicted with animal heads and human bodies. Anubis with the head of a jackal, Horus with the head of a falcon, Sobek with the head of a crocodile. Mainstream Egyptology explains these as purely symbolic representations of divine attributes. Ancient astronaut theorists offer a different read. What if these images are not symbolic at all? What if they are the closest visual representation an ancient artist could produce of something they genuinely witnessed? A being that was not fully human and not fully animal, but something else entirely. A hybrid. This idea takes an even stranger turn in West Africa, among the Dogon people of Mali. For decades, researchers have been fascinated by Dogon oral traditions describing a star system invisible to the naked eye, the binary star system of Sirius A and Sirius B. The Dogon reportedly had detailed knowledge of Sirius B's existence and its orbital behavior long before Western astronomers confirmed the star's existence with telescopes in the 20th century. According to Dogon legend, this knowledge came from a being called Nomo, described as an amphibious creature that arrived from the sky and taught the Dogon people advanced knowledge, including astronomy. Whether or not you accept the theory, the timeline is genuinely strange. How did an isolated tribal community without telescopes describe a star system that would take modern astronomy centuries to verify? Skeptics have proposed answers. Contact with European missionaries or astronomers in the 20th century, cultural transmission through trade routes, or simple misinterpretation by early anthropologists recording the myths. Ancient astronaut theorists reject these explanations as too convenient, arguing that the specificity of the Dogon's astronomical claims is too precise to be a coincidence or contamination. Now, let's talk about physical evidence, because this is where ancient astronaut theorists say the story stops being just about old texts and starts being about the human body itself. In 1965, archaeologists working in Iraq's Kish region uncovered a set of engraved seals depicting elongated skulls with a cranial shape unlike anything typically seen in a standard human anatomy. Elongated skulls have since been found across the globe, in Peru, in Egypt, in parts of Europe. Mainstream archaeology attributes these skulls to a practice called cranial deformation, the deliberate binding of an infant's skull during the early years of development to achieve an elongated shape for reasons of status, beauty, or cultural identity. This explanation is well documented and supported by direct physical evidence, including the wooden and cloth binding devices found alongside some remains. But ancient astronaut theorists point to a subset of these skulls, particularly the famous Paracas skulls found on the southern coast of Peru, and argue that some specimens show cranial volume and structure that they claim goes beyond what artificial binding alone could produce. They argue this points not to a cultural practice, but to a genuinely different skeletal structure, possibly indicating a population with non-standard ancestry. It's important to be direct here. Mainstream researchers who have examined these same skulls maintain that cranial deformation fully accounts for the shape, and DNA testing conducted on Paracas remains has returned largely inconclusive or contested results, without producing accepted scientific evidence of non-human ancestry. This is one of the more contested pieces of evidence in the ancient astronaut community, and it's worth presenting it exactly as it is, a claim under dispute, not a settled fact. From ancient skulls, the theory jumps forward thousands of years to a phenomenon that ancient astronaut theorists argue is the modern continuation of the exact same hybridization story, alien abduction reports. Since the mid-20th century, tens of thousands of people across the world have come forward with strikingly similar accounts. They describe being taken from their beds, their cars, or open fields, often at night, by beings with large dark eyes and gray or pale skin. And overwhelmingly, according to researchers who study these reports, one detail comes up again and again: medical procedures. Specifically, procedures that abductees describe as reproductive in nature. The extraction of eggs, the collection of sperm, and in a significant number of testimonies, being shown children the witnesses are told are theirs. Children described as pale, thin, with large heads and eyes, and an unmistakably alien appearance layered over recognizably human features. Investigative journalist Linda Moulton Howe, who has spent decades collecting these testimonies, has argued that the consistency of these accounts across unconnected individuals, cultures, and even decades is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence or fantasy. Former UK Ministry of Defense official Nick Pope, who spent years investigating UFO reports as part of his government role, has stated publicly that a significant number of abduction testimonies center on the theme of genetic material being harvested, eggs, sperm, and tissue samples, as if some outside intelligence were conducting a long-running biological program on the human species. Regression hypnotherapist Barbara Lamb has worked with numerous self-described abductees and reports that many independently describe similar hybrid nurseries. Sterile, brightly lit, rooms filled with hybrid infants that the witnesses are somehow made to feel a parental bond with, despite having no memory of carrying or fathering the child through conventional means. Skeptical researchers offer alternative explanations for these accounts, including sleep paralysis, a well-documented neurological phenomenon that produces vivid hallucinations and a sensation of paralysis upon waking, as well as false memory syndrome, which can occur particularly after hypnotic regression, a technique many mainstream psychologists consider unreliable for recovering accurate memories. These are real, well-supported alternative explanations, and they deserve mention alongside the abduction testimonies themselves. Still, ancient astronaut theorists argue that skepticism alone doesn't account for every detail, particularly cases involving multiple witnesses reporting the same event. Independently, or physical evidence such as unexplained scarring, missing time verified by external sources, or, in a small number of highly publicized cases, unexplained pregnancies that abductees say vanished without medical explanation. And then there's the strange and unsettling world of animal mutilation cases, a phenomenon that has been reported since the 1960s, most heavily concentrated in rural areas of the American West. The pattern is consistent. Livestock, most often cattle and horses, found dead under bizarre circumstances. Soft tissue, eyes, tongues, reproductive organs, removed with what witnesses and some investigators describe as surgical precision. No blood found at the scene despite major tissue removal. No predator tracks, no signs of struggle. In one widely cited case from Colorado's San Luis Valley, a horse named Lady was found dead in a pasture, its skull stripped completely. Clean of flesh, despite having been seen alive by its owners only 2 days earlier, with no blood, no scavenger activity, and no explanation from local authorities. Author and researcher Nick Redfern has investigated dozens of these cases and argues that the precision of the tissue removal, combined with a complete absence of blood at the scene, rules out predator activity and points instead to a deliberate technical process. One consistent, he argues, with the harvesting of genetic material rather than an act of predation or vandalism. Government and university investigations into cattle mutilation cases over the decades, including a formal FBI-assisted investigation launched in the late 1970s, have generally attributed the phenomenon to natural predation, insect activity, and decomposition patterns that can mimic surgical precision under certain conditions, though several of these investigations have also acknowledged an inability to fully explain every documented case. For ancient astronaut theorists, these mutilations aren't a separate phenomenon from the ancient hybrid story. They argue it's the same program, just observed at a different stage. If an outside intelligence has been engineering hybrid life on Earth since Sumerian times, they ask, why would that program stop? Livestock mutilations in this theory become evidence of ongoing genetic sampling, ensuring compatibility, refining a hybridization process that, according to these researchers, has been running quietly for thousands of years. Which brings the theory to its most direct and most debated claim, that these hybrids aren't confined to ancient myth, alien abduction testimony, or livestock pastures. According to a portion of the ancient astronaut community, hybrids may already be walking among us, indistinguishable in appearance from ordinary people, but carrying, according to this theory, a genetic thread that traces back to that original intervention in Sumer, or Genesis, or wherever you choose to place humanity's first contact. Physicist Michael Dennin, when pressed on these claims from a scientific standpoint, has noted that human genetics is remarkably well mapped in the modern era, and no verified genetic anomaly has ever been confirmed by mainstream science to indicate non-human ancestry in a living human being. That's an important scientific fact to sit alongside the theory, because it's the central point where mainstream genetics and ancient astronaut theory diverge completely. One side says the absence of confirmed evidence means the theory is unsupported. The other side argues that if such a program exists, its entire purpose would be concealment, and that the absence of confirmed evidence is exactly what a successful cover-up would look like. Neither side has definitive proof, and that ultimately is the real story here. Not a settled answer, but an open question that has survived for thousands of years across cultures that had no contact with one another, all describing strikingly similar events, and all converging on the same unsettling idea that somewhere in humanity's deep past, something from outside our world may have reached down and altered the course of our biology. Why would ancient Sumerians, isolated Bronze Age Israelites, Mayan priests, Egyptian scribes, and a remote tribe in Mali all tell some version of the same story without ever meeting each other? Ancient astronaut theorists say the answer is simple, because it happened and it left a mark on every culture that witnessed it. Mainstream historians and archaeologists say the answer is just as simple, but points the other way, that these are universal human storytelling patterns, born from a shared psychological need to explain where we come from and where our differences, physical, cultural, and social, originated. Both explanations are on the table. Only one, if it's true, means we are not the only intelligence that has ever shaped human history. So the question stands, the same one that's kept researchers, authors, and skeptics arguing for more than 50 years. Were ancient civilizations describing gods or describing visitors? Were the Nephilim myth or memory? And if hybrids were created once, thousands of years ago, is there any real reason to believe that project ever stopped? That's the claim. That's the evidence people point to. But before we close this out, there's more ground to cover. Because the theory doesn't stop at Sumer, Genesis, and abduction testimony, there's an entire second layer of evidence that ancient astronaut theorists point to, one built not on texts, but on stone. Travel to the high plateau of Bolivia, roughly 2.5 miles above sea level, and you'll find the ruins of Puma Punku, a site so precisely cut that modern engineers have struggled to explain how it was built with Bronze Age tools. Massive andesite blocks, some weighing well over 100 tons, are carved with interlocking geometric precision, flat surfaces so exact that some researchers argue they could only have been produced with machine tooling. Mainstream archaeology attributes Puma Punku to the Tiwanaku civilization, using stone on stone, abrasion, copper chisels, and immense organized labor over long periods of time. Ancient astronaut theorists counter that the precision of the cuts, measured in some cases to within fractions of a millimeter, goes beyond what hand tools could reasonably achieve, and they argue this level of technical mastery lines up with the broader claim that early humans received direct assistance, whether through instruction or genetic enhancement, from an outside intelligence. That same argument extends to artwork found across the ancient world that appears, according to these researchers, to depict hybrid beings directly. In India, ancient temple carvings and religious texts describe the Nagas, serpent beings capable of taking human form, intermarrying with human royalty, and producing hybrid offspring who ruled entire dynasties. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of the Aztec and earlier Mesoamerican cultures, is depicted as a being who descended from the sky, taught humans agriculture, astronomy, and law, and who some ancient astronaut theorists argue represents another cultural memory of the same hybridization event described in Sumer and Genesis. In ancient Egypt, beyond the animal-headed gods already mentioned, tomb paintings and hieroglyphic reliefs at sites like the Temple of Abydos have sparked decades of debate over carvings that skeptics call simple overlapping inscriptions, but that some fringe researchers claim resemble modern aircraft and vehicles, a claim mainstream Egyptologists reject outright, attributing the shapes to recarved and overlapping royal titles from different periods of restoration. It's worth pausing here to be clear about where the mainstream and fringe interpretations genuinely diverge, because that gap is the entire engine of this theory. Mainstream archaeology and history explain nearly all of this evidence through known human capability, sophisticated ancient engineering achieved through scale, time, and lost techniques we don't fully understand yet, not extraterrestrial intervention. Religious mythology as a shared human tool for explaining the unexplainable, not literal. Historical record. And elongated skulls, animal-headed gods, and serpent deities as cultural, ceremonial, and symbolic practices, not biological evidence of hybridization. Ancient astronaut theorists reject the idea that so many independent civilizations would converge on strikingly similar sky-being, hybrid offspring narratives purely by coincidence, and they argue that mainstream science tends to explain away anomalies individually without addressing why the same pattern shows up on nearly every continent. Neither side has forced the other to concede, and that unresolved tension is exactly why this theory has had the staying power it has for over half a century. Let's bring this back to the present day, because this is where the theory gets its sharpest edge, and where ancient astronaut researchers argue the story stops being ancient history and becomes something closer to an ongoing current event. Beyond individual abduction testimonies, researchers who study this phenomenon point to what they describe as generational patterns, cases where multiple family members across different generations report similar experiences, similar physical markings, and similar encounters with beings they describe in near identical terms, despite having no contact with one another's accounts beforehand. Some researchers, including Moulton Howe, have argued that this generational pattern suggests something closer to a long-term breeding program than a series of isolated, unconnected incidents, a program that, if real, would require consistency and continuity across decades, not a single event. There's also the matter of what some investigators call hybrid disclosure testimony. Individuals who claim direct, close-up encounters with beings who appear mostly human but display subtle physical differences, unusually pale or translucent, skin, larger than average eyes, thin builds, and in some testimonies, an apparent difficulty adjusting to ordinary human environments, food, and social behavior. These accounts are almost entirely anecdotal, without physical evidence that has satisfied any mainstream scientific body, and it's important to state that plainly. But within the community of researchers who study this topic, the sheer volume and cross-cultural consistency of these reports is treated as its own form of evidence, the idea being that if enough people in enough different places with no connection to each other describe the same specific and unusual details, something is generating that consistency, even if science hasn't identified what that something is yet. Skeptics push back hard on this point, and it's worth giving that pushback its full weight. Cross-cultural consistency in a strange testimony isn't unique to alien abduction. It shows up in reports of ghosts, demonic encounters, and folk creatures across nearly every culture in human history, long before global media could have spread a shared template. Psychologists point to shared human neurology, the same brain structures, the same sleep cycles, the same fear responses, as a more grounded explanation for why unrelated people around the world report strikingly similar experiences during moments of altered consciousness, whether that's sleep paralysis, trauma, or dissociation. That's a legitimate scientific position, and it deserves to sit right next to the theory itself, not be erased from the conversation. So where does that leave the overall case for human hybrids? It leaves it exactly where it has sat for decades, unresolved, contested, and endlessly compelling. On one side, you have an enormous body of ancient text, artwork, and oral tradition from cultures that had no contact with one another, all converging on strikingly similar accounts of sky beings, divine bloodlines, and hybrid offspring. You have modern testimony, thousands of accounts, collected over more than half a century, describing reproductive experimentation with unsettling consistency. You have physical anomalies like elongated skulls and precision-cut megalithic stonework that continue to generate genuine scientific debate over how they were achieved. And you have a modern phenomenon, animal mutilation, that remains only partially explained by official investigations decades after it first appeared. On the other side, you have mainstream science, archaeology, and psychology offering grounded, evidence-based explanations for nearly every individual piece of that puzzle. Explanations rooted in known human capability, known cultural practices, and known psychological phenomena, without requiring an outside intelligence at all. The gap between those two positions hasn't closed in 50 years of research, investigation, and debate, and it likely isn't closing anytime soon. What ancient astronaut theorists argue at the core of all of this is not that they've proven hybrids exist. It's that the pattern is too consistent, too old, and too widespread to dismiss without a serious look. That when you line up a Sumerian tablet, a passage from Genesis, a Mayan creation myth, a Dogon oral tradition about a star system they shouldn't have known existed, and tens of thousands of modern testimonies describing the same reproductive procedures, you're either looking at the most persistent coincidence in human history, or you're looking at the fragmented memory of something real, something that happened once, a very long time ago, and that some researchers believe never actually stopped. Whether you find that convincing or not is, in the end, up to you. But it's hard to walk away from the full scope of this evidence without at least asking the question these researchers have been asking for decades. If our ancestors really were describing an encounter with something not of this world, and if that encounter really did leave a genetic mark on the human story, what would that mean for who we are today? And who might still be walking among us right now, indistinguishable from anyone else, carrying a bloodline that stretches back to the very beginning of recorded history? That question, more than any single piece of evidence, is what has kept this theory alive for over half a century. And as long as ancient texts keep getting re-examined, as long as abduction reports keep pouring in with the same eerie details, and as long as science keeps finding things in the archaeological record that don't fit neatly into the existing timeline, that question isn't going away. Are we the only species to have ever shaped human history? Or did something else reach into our story a very long time ago and leave its signature in our blood? Before we wrap this up, it's worth looking at how the researchers most associated with this theory actually frame their own conclusions, because the picture is more layered than a simple yes or no belief. Eric von Daniken, often considered the father of the modern ancient astronaut movement, has said for decades that his goal was never to hand people a final answer, but to point at the gaps mainstream archaeology has struggled to fill. The precision, stonework, the recurring sky god narratives, the technical detail embedded in supposedly primitive myths, and ask why those gaps get so little attention. Giorgio Tsoukalos, the publisher and researcher most associated with the modern ancient aliens era of this theory, has taken that argument further, framing the hybrid question specifically as a matter of biological continuity. If beings from elsewhere seeded or altered early human development, he argues, there is no logical reason to assume that project would have a single starting point and no follow-up, especially given how consistently the genetic tampering theme reappears across separate eras, from ancient religious texts to 20th and 21st century abduction testimony. David Childress, author and frequent voice in this space, approaches the evidence from the angle of lost technology, arguing that sites like Pumapunku, the Great Pyramid Complex at Giza, and the massive stone platforms at Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon represent a level of engineering that either implies a lost advanced human civilization or outside assistance, and that either conclusion still requires rewriting significant parts of the accepted historical timeline. Nick Redfern, focusing more on the modern side of the phenomenon, has repeatedly emphasized that mutilation cases and abduction testimony share such specific, repeated technical details: precise incisions, missing reproductive tissue, described medical procedures, that he considers coincidence or mass hallucination an increasingly difficult explanation to accept at face value, even without a confirmed identity behind who or what is responsible. On the opposing side, mainstream scientists like physicist Michael Dennin represent the position that extraordinary claims of this scale require a correspondingly extraordinary standard of evidence, physical, testable, and repeatable, and that anecdote, however consistent or widespread, does not meet that bar, no matter how many people report it. This is, fundamentally, the heart of the disagreement. It isn't that mainstream science denies people are having strange, often deeply real and disturbing experiences. It's that the leap from an unexplained experience occurred to "this proves." Extraterrestrial genetic intervention in human history requires a level of proof that so far hasn't been produced in a form the broader scientific community accepts. That gap between personal testimony and scientific proof is exactly where this theory has lived for the past 50 years, and exactly where it continues to live today. It's not a closed case in either direction. It's an open one, kept open by new testimony, new archaeological finds, and new questions that keep surfacing every time researchers think they've reached the bottom of it. So here's where that leaves anyone taking a serious look at this material. The ancient texts aren't going away. The Sumerian tablets describing the Anunnaki, the Genesis account of the Nephilim, the Book of Enoch's Watchers, the Dogon's impossible knowledge of Sirius B, the animal-headed gods of Egypt, the feathered serpent of Mesoamerica, all of it remains exactly as strange and exactly as unresolved as it was when researchers first started connecting these threads together decades ago. The modern testimony isn't going away either. The abduction, reports, the consistent reproductive themes, the unexplained animal mutilations stretching back to the 1960s. The generational patterns some investigators claim to have documented across families with no contact with one another. None of it, on its own, is proof. But taken together, it's exactly the kind of pattern that has kept this theory alive, kept researchers investigating, and kept audiences asking the same question decade after decade. What if the oldest stories we ever told weren't myths at all, but memories, fragmented, reshaped by time and language, but rooted in something that actually happened? If that's true, the story of the human hybrid didn't end in ancient Sumer, and it didn't end with the Nephilim, and it certainly didn't end with a horse found dead in a Colorado pasture. According to the researchers who've spent their careers chasing this theory, it's still unfolding right now, quietly, largely unproven, but persistent enough that after more than half a century of investigation, nobody involved in this field is ready to close the book on it. And that, ultimately, is the real hook of this entire theory. Not a single smoking gun, not one undeniable piece of proof, but an unbroken thread running through nearly every ancient civilization on Earth, resurfacing again in modern testimony, and never fully explained away by either side of the debate. Whether you walk away from this convinced that we are the product of an ancient genetic experiment, or convinced that this is simply the oldest and most persistent story humans have ever told themselves, one thing remains true. The question of where we really came from and who, or what, may have had a hand in it is still very much open.